Okay, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Carlson. I'm a professor at Aalto University School of Business in Helsinki, Finland, and would like to welcome you on behalf of the other panelists and the International Management Division of the Academy of Management, which are the organizers of today. I'm really lucky to have a very experienced panel with me today. We have Zaheer, who's the Dean of the Carlson School at the University of Minnesota. Harry Lane, who is a professor at Northeastern University, and in fact also was acting dean at Northeastern for a while, and also Andreas Schotter from the Ivey School of Business at Western University in Canada. Today, we're going to be talking about how international business teaching is likely to evolve post-COVID-19. Most of us have been really wrapped up with surviving COVID-19 and the adjustments to that. I'm sure people like Sri serving as dean at the moment are surely feeling the pressures of that from the last months, and I can sure relate to that, having previously served as dean of Nottingham, China myself. Fortunately, was happy to be out of that position during this crisis. But the question now is, where do we, when this eventually works its way out, find international business in terms of the methods, in terms of program design, in terms of the content that we will be teaching. Probably it will look a little different than it did before. So that's what we would like to talk about today. A few housekeeping things before we begin. If you have technical issues, you can use the chat button at the bottom, and we do have a technical support person online watching that. There's also a Q&A function at the bottom, and would encourage you to write some questions there by clicking on Q&A. You can also vote by using the thumbs up button, and we will try to answer the questions that are most highly ranked, that is the most people who have voted for them, first when we come to Q&A time. We are going to try to have several different times of Q&A during this, so we hope for a somewhat interactive session. And while I primarily will be reading myself out the questions to the panel members, we also may give a chance to have a few people talk orally with their questions as well, or even put you on with the video. So be ready if you'd like to do that. We also will have a couple polls during the session, so hopefully we'll keep you awake. So in any case, why don't we get started? We'd like to start by talking about content a little bit, and how content may evolve as international business teaching moves out of the COVID-19 period eventually. So for example, I wonder how our teaching about supply chain may change. Perhaps both due to COVID-19 and recent actions by the US government towards companies like Huawei, maybe companies will be thinking about if they want just to have one supplier or having multiple suppliers. I think we'll probably see them moving more towards multiple suppliers, and we might see somewhat more of a move towards regional rather than global supply chains. But I'd be very curious to hear what our panel members think about that and how we might adjust international business teaching as a result. Perhaps we can start off with Andreas. Andreas, what do you think about how we'll be talking about global supply chains?
You know, just in principle, over the last few months, even before, there's been a panic about globalization, the retreat of globalization, and so on and so forth. I think that we're actually in the most exciting phase for research on internationalization, international business, and as well as teaching on international business. And we have to cut out the noise. Of course, the COVID crisis has increased the discussions about bringing production back to home countries or to every country. I don't think that's really possible. And I do believe that global supply chains remain critical. And when you look and talk underneath the propaganda and general business, you will see that many companies are still relying heavily and will rely heavily, not just for cost efficiency, but also for innovation, for specialization, and so on international supply chains. Having said this, I think there will be a much more sophisticated way how to develop supply chains in the future, particular more contingencies, more regionalization, and so on and so forth. I think this this is there, and we need to really talk to businesses and don't just listen to the CNNs of this world and propaganda up there. So supply chain teaching, I think, becomes even more relevant in the future than it has ever been.
Thanks, Andreas. So make sure we sift through the propaganda a little bit and also tie a little bit into the globalization issues that we've been hearing in all sorts of other ways. Zaheer, can you share with us some of your thoughts about global supply chain teaching?
Right. Obviously, I think the pandemic has just accelerated some trends that were already there. People were already thinking about how to diversify their supply chains. People were already thinking about how to shorten supply chains, whether certain aspects could be brought back closer to the consumer and maybe with much greater automation and so on. So these trends were already in place, and perhaps they've been accelerated a bit by the pandemic, but I don't think the fundamentals change very much. I agree with Andreas there. Mm-hmm. What I have found talking to our local CEOs in town is that, in the initial stages of the pandemic, obviously this becomes a huge risk management problem. And I think we've moved away from teaching about risk management in international business, and maybe that needs to come back a little more front and center, and all kinds of risks, including political risks and so on. And now, of course, a pandemic risk that nobody had thought about. But as I talk to CEOs in our community, what I'm beginning to understand is that those firms that had invested in their suppliers, built trust over years, invested in the communities in which their manufacturing plants and so on were located, actually did not suffer as much, because if a supplier has to kind of decide between who they're going to supply, they're going to supply the person who's invested in them, who they trust, who they've built a very strong relationship with. So it all boils down, in my understanding, to really the kind of trust you built with your employees, with your customers, with your suppliers. And those firms that did a good job on that have actually survived this pandemic, I think, and will survive this pandemic better than others. I mean, it's a great research question. I wish I was still doing research, but this is what I hear anyway from the CEOs in town.
Thanks, Sri. So that's really interesting to think about risk management more, something that indeed we haven't talked a whole lot about in recent years in IB, and also to think about what one can do to make sure whatever supply chain you have, that you develop relationships in a way that you'll be sort of served best. So maybe we can turn to next question, thinking about, yes, Harry.
Carl, let me just chime in there briefly.
Okay.
That I like what Sri said about focusing again on risk management. But I also think we need to start looking and talking about how companies need to patrol their supply chains. And there's been a lot of discussion about modern slavery, human trafficking, child labor, and many of the more enlightened and progressive companies are taking real actions to patrol them and take responsibility for what's going on in their supply chain. So it's not just about location and risk management and all that, but I suppose some of the things that are going on increase your risk. And we can see companies in the United States that have suffered because they have not paid attention to patrolling the supply chain. And I'm thinking, I talk about Nestle and slavery and the fishing, gummy bears in Germany, and there is a lot of companies that need to pay attention to this.
Thanks, Harry. That's a really good point. So if we move to our next question, to think a little bit about sort of the design of multinationals more broadly. Over the years, people have been talking about it being important to have sort of more distributed multinationals with subsidiaries increasingly taking on roles beyond simply sales, but not even only production, but R&D, et cetera. The move to have more sort of regional headquarters that have more different powers and a lot of flow of information and knowledge between different subsidiaries. Do you think that this will change at all as a result of COVID-19, and what should we be teaching our students about that? Can we start with Harry on this? Harry, do you hear us?
Who?
We'll start with you, Harry.
Okay. Well, first of all, you have to recognize, I don't teach a traditional IB course. I teach something to be more international management or cross-cultural. And I don't think companies are going to necessarily pull back from globalization. They're going to be doing it in a new form, more online. And I think we're also seeing more companies, the born global types of companies, the smaller ones. So I don't think they're going to retreat, but I do think they're going to find new ways of dealing with it and being more careful about who they work with in their in the countries, and use their networks much more effectively than they are right now.
Okay, thanks. Sarik, what about your opinion?
You know, I agree with Harry. I think it's I don't think it's a retreat from globalization, but I think it's going to be a more nuanced evolution. You know, for example, everybody's gotten used to working remotely now. So I think remote work will be more of a feature, and that can facilitate some high, you know, especially where you're looking at high value digital outputs. There could be much more remote work built into the natural kind of structure of a multinational. And then, but on the other hand, I think the physical outputs, I mean, you know, there's probably going to be more automation. And as I said, an effort to collapse the value chains a little bit, diversify the value chains, bring them closer to the customer and things of that kind. But these are sort of, but I think the most critical change, which I hope happens, is that I think firms have to stop looking at their supply chains or even their international organization as dots on a map. I think you have to embed yourself deeply in the communities in which you are operating. And the companies that do that well, they become insiders, they're part of the fabric of society. They're not viewed as, you know, foreigners. And, you know, my pet peeve, of course, is always the liability of foreigners and how do you get out of that. But I think this is an important issue that you really have to invest and commit to places that you're operating in. And I think we moved away from teaching that a bit by our focus on global efficiency in the, you know, in the last couple of decades. And so this idea of greater rootedness is something that I would promote.
Okay, thanks, Sri. Moving on, can we move to the next thing where you can hopefully come in, Andreas, as we're a little bit pressed on time. What I'd like to do now is ask each of you to say what you think is the change in terms of content that is going, in terms of teaching IB, that is going to be the biggest change in the post-COVID-19 world. And let's start off with Andreas.
Yeah, that's interesting. A great question, to be honest. And I think something they have all been struggling over time, and even struggle in our research sometimes to make it clear to others that international business has something to do with cross-border. And not so much with you know, a patchwork of different countries, different cultures. This is just the underlying context. And talking about these connections, not so much about the nodes anymore, where companies operate, will, I think, become a much more important aspect of teaching. And then how these different nodes differ is basically what Harry was referring to earlier, right? When he teaches the international management dimension. I think these two dimensions will become more distinctive. You know, understanding on one side, even Sri mentioned that, the local embeddedness, the local context, how to operate locally, but for an international business, how to create meaningful supply chain, value chains, I prefer to talk about value chains, becomes much more critical. And how do I structure the world? Geographic regions will not cut it anymore, right? And years ago, Honeywell has restructured in a way that they defined growth regions, and that was before the situation in Syria erupted, as Central Asia, Russia, and Brazil. That's a growth region for them. I mean, there are very new configurations here. These connections need to be discussed in a much more systematic way and taught in a more systematic way, so that an international manager is not just someone who understands just the other side in another location that she or he is talking to.
Okay, thanks very much. Sri, what about you? What do you think is the most important thing we haven't talked about so far?
Well, gosh, I think, as we, I haven't actually taught international business for a while, but I think as we think about how do we, create international experience, I mean, this, the global mindset is still extremely important. We want our students to go away really feeling comfortable worldwide. And I know there have been a couple of questions on how do we do that when there's no travel. I think hopefully the no travel is a fairly short-term effect. And what we're noticing, we haven't backed away at all from our study abroad requirement for our undergraduates. And what we're seeing is that there's still a lot of students very interested, signing up just as strongly as ever for courses that we're running in next year in 2021. So hopefully that'll come back. And meanwhile, I think the kinds of things we're doing, I mean, one of the interesting examples is, we have something called a medical industry evaluation lab, and we are partnering actually with the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, and we have our students and students at Karolinska jointly evaluating the intellectual property and market potential for different medical industry innovations that half of them come from Minnesota, half of them come from Sweden, and the students are working on teams doing this. And while this doesn't substitute for that immersive global experience, I think things like this are going to be extremely important. And our institutions, AIB, AOM, the IM division, and these are the places where we can make the connections to do these kinds of things.
Yeah, indeed, how to deal with sort of getting simulated or real international business experience when you can't travel is a big issue. We have a number of questions about it, and we're going to talk about that more later on, but maybe we'll come to this again in the question and answer soon. Harry, what about you? What do you think is the key issue we're going to be focusing on in terms of content in a little different way?
Excuse me. I think there are two issues that we need to talk about. And one I would characterize as the dark side of globalization, and not just focus on the market-oriented or production-oriented issues such as supply chain, value chain, et cetera. Those are important. But we need to talk about the things I already mentioned, for example, modern slavery, human trafficking. Very little, I think, is done on cybersecurity, and companies are very exposed to problems in cybersecurity. And we also need to be thinking about migration in terms of national security and immigration. And I think these are all issues that need to be talked about. And I think what I would say is our research and our teaching needs to start in the field with what's really happening and the issues that companies are facing, and not just in the library with the latest journal article. So I think we need to research and teach about reality.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. So some diverse views about what's going to be the biggest changes moving forward. Let's take a poll that suggests a number of different things to see what people think. If you could choose one of the items that you can see in the polling in terms of what you think will be the most important items that are likely to change in IB moving forward. If we could get some people to vote on that, we'll then take a look at the results. I'll give you a minute to make the poll. Okay, well, I think we'll end the poll here and show you the results. We got about 75 people voting. And it seems that the extent we focus on regional versus global wins out as the area that people think will focusing the most on, and perhaps also more focus on sustainability and corporate social responsibility moving forward is also likely to happen. Perhaps we can continue on with the theme that Sri talked about. And I know that there are a number of questions that have been relating to this, relating to how we can deal with having sort of simulated experience for people who can't travel, or even just in a more environmental or economical way moving forward. So a number of people have asked about this, and I'd be curious to hear other ideas from panelists of how one can deal with this. One thing, for example, that I've done is that I have put together a video about doing business in Russia, taking lots of different quotes that I've done from interviewing different people and some visits I've had to factories and whatever, since I can't, do a study trip to Russia anymore. Also, there are other things that are happening that are video projects, like Harvard's Creating Emerging Markets database, which there'll be a session on at AIB coming up that Charles Donaraj and Tarun Khanna are going to be running, which seems to be a great source of video content which people can use. But of course, there's no substitute for really being exactly in person. I wonder if anyone has some ideas about how you can create a simulated experience. Andreas?
Yeah, first of all, I don't think that simulation alone will cut it. We need to have students eventually take foreign experience. I think what Sri said before, not backing down on the international experience, is absolutely crucial. We had to do so during COVID. We have two of our programs that have all students having an international experience. The MSc program, all students in the international business stream have to work for 2 months in an emerging market in Vietnam, India, or Peru, for a while also Nicaragua. This couldn't take place. They are working virtually with these companies at the moment. It's not ideal, but what we have learned from this is there's still some cross-cultural learning, some on-the-ground experience, and so this is working for right now. But we are completely committed that these international experience going forward. Another mode is in the SEMS program, which we are part of, 33 schools. We just created a course where one course will be taught across all these different schools, but only about 40% is similar. So the rest is on the ground, and of the 40%, it's 20% content delivery and 20% on the projects. And these are projects that include at least 3 continents on each of the student teams. So that's something where the students can actually work across, have never met, have to find a way to connect internationally. It is a fix at the moment for the situation, but I think some of the learnings from this experience can be carried over in the future in creating quicker international experiences in potentially non-specialized courses.
I think that's a good point to make sure that and realize that there are some opportunities for this virtual international experience, which you can gain to start with. And you've mentioned some opportunities, and Sri also talked about the program with Karolinska. We're doing some things like this as well. Harry, what do you think? What do you think about getting international experience when one can't travel as much, and even after one can, but might not want to quite travel as much?
Well, I think I don't want to be a pessimist, so I'm going to say that we will get back to international travel, maybe not as much as before, but I don't think it's going to come to an end. In the meantime, I think we need to be thinking about ways to do it. And I think it's things like Zoom and building into your courses. Let me give you an example. My online MBA class just ended. We do a virtual team building or team decision-making exercise, actual experience, and have reasonably senior jobs. And they're educating their classmates about this. So I think the use of virtual technology and things like that in your class can help. It's not as good as being on the ground, but it might be the best we can do in the short term or the medium term.
Okay, thanks. We had a number of questions. I just had some technical challenge, I'm sorry to say, and all of the questions have disappeared from my so I apologize about that. If you've sent a question, maybe you can send it again and it will reappear, I hope. But I know one of the questions was how we might see the role of China changing in global supply chains. Would anyone like to comment on that?
Let me take that on first. I do believe that China will play a role. What we often forget is that China is the second largest economy in the world, and it's also a market. So if you want to play in China, you've got to be in China in a significant way, right? So you have to build up a supply chain in general that will serve China. And as a multinational company, I don't think you will. You want to, despite greater risk management, you don't want to have multiple parallel supply chains that don't add additional value to your organization. So I don't think that China will take an extreme hit. It will take some hit, and companies will do better risk management. And the topic that Harry addressed before, how do we do business? Who do we do business with? What comes over has become really apparent. And China has been taking a hit on that side too, with the issues about PPE, personal protection equipment, and so on. This will actually help China to upgrade their supplier base. So I don't think that China will go away. It's too big of a market, too big of a base, too big of a scale of everything. But there will be adjustments, also to the better.
Okay, we also have a question from Nick, who asks us, we need to create courses potentially that are taught collaboratively across borders and institutions where 2 or more faculty members are having distributed lectures with virtual team projects, etc. Do we have any experiences of that any of the panel members would like to talk about a little bit?
Well, I just had I wouldn't call it exactly a team teaching, but in our online course on Wednesday nights, I have a live chat with our students, and Ms. Nevsky joined from Ivey for one of those, and it works well. And I think we could do an awful lot more of that. And I just offered to visit a class for another colleague because more of us are using Zoom or some other technology, and particularly we use Zoom, and it makes it really easy to contribute, much like the 4 of us are doing now.
I agree. I mean, I think in many of our classes, we do have those kinds of cross-border collaborative kind of experiences. I think one which has been running for over 20 years is a virtual team project across our executive MBA programs in China and Vienna and the Carlson School. And it's a lot. I mean, it helps that we have built relationships. Again, I come back to trust with the institutions involved, with the faculty. The faculty know each other. So there's a kind of that helps certainly in getting these things together. There's a lot of coordination involved. It's not easy to pull a good experience off. But at the same time, I think students appreciate that even when there are difficulties, these are the kinds of difficulties they're going to face when they're working remotely in their own companies, or they're working multinational, multicultural teams in their own companies. And so, part of the learning is sometimes the obstacles, the fact that someone's internet isn't as good, or in China, they're not able to access something you sent them on, Gmail or whatever it is. So there's all this learning that has to happen in the process. And that's in a way, the benefit of these kinds of collaborations.
Right. Yeah, no, I think those are some good examples. Surely, I think there'll be more with different professors from different schools collaborating together. One thing that I've done, though, that I think has also been useful, it's a little related to this, is bringing in executives virtually. And particularly since we're often talking about multinational companies, normally I've only been able to bring in 1 or 2 people from one company at any one time. But one thing I've tried now is to bring in one executive as sort of a key person, but then with virtual means, have a number of different people from different subsidiaries and different functions involved in a discussion in the classroom. And I found this to be a useful way to move forward. Okay, so we've talked about content some. I think we should probably move on a little bit to think about program structure. And I wonder what you think in terms of program structure. Perhaps we could take a poll first to think about the percentage of MBA programs that we think might be moving online as we move post COVID-19. So if everyone could, in the next minute or so, answer what percentage of MBA programs you think will be fully online post COVID-19. Okay, so we got about 90 answers or so, and it seems that the winner is 41 to 60% of MBA programs will be fully online, according to our participants. Let's look at one other thing, which, sorry, 1 second here. Sure. What about if we switch to thinking about what percentage of class time you think will be online for blended MBA programs? A lot of people think blended MBAs, in teaching may be the future. So if you could all answer that. Okay, and I'll share the results here. It seems that it's close between 46 to 60% and 61 to 75% of online content in blended programs being online. So clearly, at least the participants in this session think that we're going to be seeing a lot more online teaching, which is something I surely believe in. What I'd like to ask the panel is, when we talk especially about blended programs, what is it that we're going to see that is online and what is going to be done in person? Would we have some suggestion on that? Perhaps we could start with you, Andreas.
So we started last year a blended program, which was set across all courses. Blended MBA program, 40% asynchronous online, 60% synchronous face-to-face in our traditional case teaching workshop. I have to say, Ivey had decades ago, a video conferencing MBA, which at the time had technological challenges, what wasn't too bad. This is a very different program what we're having. And the opportunity here is not to just throw something at the screen and think I'm teaching in the same way as I do in the regular classroom. So a lot more preparation, a lot more thought needs to be put in. And I love to quote, actually in this regards, my favorite person on the screen. Always remember that learning is more important than teaching, right? So
Did you hear that?
I don't know, Harry, where I heard this, right? It's on my mind. So what we have learned is that, for example, having a rigid structure for kicking off this program was really helpful, but in reality, not every course lends itself to this kind of ratio, right? And we need to go beyond equity of in-classroom time to faculty. Some courses may have to be 80% face-to-face in a traditional model in a case teaching work class. Other classes maybe only 30% face-to-face. So I think there's a real opportunity, and with tools like polling, with guest speakers and so on, there can be actually an enhancement if these two pieces are being put together. But it's not about replacing one with the other. It's improving the programs. That's my opinion.
Okay, thanks for that. Sri, what do you think about what components we're going to be seeing? I mean, you're obviously involved in designing a lot of programs at the Carlson School. What are the components that you're now looking to have, virtual versus physical?
I agree with Andreas. It so much depends on the course, and a lot of thought has to be put into it. I mean, when we had to move some of the courses that had never been online, suddenly online because of COVID, it was a little bit catch as catch can, but it was hugely helped by the fact that we had a team of instructional designers who could help our faculty think through it. But it was still done in a bit of a hurry. But as we really, if we think about moving aspects online more systematically, we have to put a whole lot more thought into it. Having said that, you can even, my Axe, as some of you know him, my husband who teaches a core strategy class, had to move. He'd never done an online course before. He was used to the in-person walk up and down, cold call, all the rest of it, case teaching philosophy. But he actually managed to replicate, I would say, 90% of what he does in a class format within the online, with a Zoom framework. So I think there's a lot of things that we're still learning and figuring out, but it's going to vary by case, and how much of it is synchronous versus asynchronous is again a big thing that's going to be different across courses.
Okay, thanks a lot. One of the things that I've been thinking about is, how program length might change, and how what you do in sort of the bulk of the program versus before and after and then some intermediate parts might change. Personally, I think we might end up getting programs that are a bit shorter, but more importantly, shorter in terms of physical presence with more virtual presence before and after, and potentially in some intervals for, executive type programs. Sri, can we come back to you? How do you see programs changing? Do you agree with my suggestions, or maybe you have some other ones?
Well, I mean, there's an immediate situation this coming year where I think all of us are looking at more compressed timeframes for semesters and so on. But
yeah, let's look more after this next year.
Yeah, post-COVID, I think there's clearly an interest in just-in-time bite-sized pieces. So we are introducing a whole lot of what we call stackable certificates. So these are, single issue kind of courses, or a sequence of courses that you can take and get a certificate, but you also collect credits, which can be used later on towards a degree if you choose to come into a program. So I think those kinds of things will increase, but I think there's still a role for a full-time experience, especially for those who are career switchers in the MBA space. I mean, if you're coming in, for instance, if you're a vet and you want to go into marketing, I think the full 2-year experience is very valuable, especially with a full summer internship and all the rest of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Can we perhaps turn to a little bit about methods when we're teaching online more specifically? So Harry, can we start with you? What do you think are the methods that are going to work best online? One of the questions that we have is, how can we make it as interactive as possible when we're online? So what methods can we use, like the polls we had today, or breakout rooms in Zoom, or, do you think cases work well online? What do you think can be used to make interactivity work? Harry?
Okay, let me go back just a little bit first to comment on what Andreas said about, learning is more important than teaching. And when I've been teaching online now for, 12, 13 years or something. And what you have to realize is that your job is to organize the learning. And as you organize the learning, the work shifts from what we normally do day to day in the classroom to a lot of the startup, planning, design, preparation. And I think it's in this phase that you decide really what can be best done asynchronously and what needs to be done synchronously. And you can't just throw a course online. I think things like modular design are important. And to make it, while I was thinking about this today, what Confucius said, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. We really need to do much more interactive, experiential types of activities online. And as I said, we try to do that with, you could have a team project online. You have collaborative assignments. You have team decision-making exercises. You can have debates, things like that work interactively. And I think you really need to be thinking about how to do that rather than, what you don't want to do is just get on and talk for an hour. You can pre-record lectures if you have to have a lecture in Panopto, for example, which is what we're using at Northeastern. But I think one of the best things that I ever heard, piece of advice, was make it short. There is a reason that TED Talks are limited to 18 minutes. You start to lose people after that. So much more interactive, much more joint projects, etc. The other thing you have to think about, though, is I don't know, as I mentioned, we had a student in Dubai and one in Barcelona. You have to understand where these people are, what time zone they're in. It's much like what we're doing right now. We're all in different time zones. So you have to be thinking about, can you do it at an accessible time? What is their internet connectivity? There's just an awful lot that goes into online teaching that a lot of people are just starting to think about.
Okay, thank you very much, Harry. Can we turn to you, Andreas? What do you think are the things we can do to make online components or entire programs as interactive and as good learning experiences as possible?
You can imagine I completely agree with Harry on that one. You have to look at these time components. What we also don't forget often is it's only one course. And even in the face-to-face times, I always try to explain and tell myself that too. You're not the only course that students take, right? So there's a tendency to throw too much at the students, and the balance between synchronous, asynchronous learning, different ways to consume the same information is important, and then spend more time in making sure that the learning outcomes are being met, right? Instead of spending this entire time physically in front of the students. I think this is super critical, right, in the future. And I also agree with the free badging and shorter programs are important, but also potentially a threat to our overall program models, right? Because people only eat what they really like to eat, and then they shop around. So that's likely not how business schools can survive in the long run. So we have built all these nice temples all around the world. How do we finance it? But I'm digressing a bit. I do believe that shorter, more concise, multimedia, interactive is important without becoming a pure edutainer. So the focus has to be on the learning.
You know, one of the things that I think you've got some really good points there. One of the things in terms of methodologies that I've found can be good is to make some methodologies that can play up, the virtual components. So for example, I used to, when teaching international negotiations, have one component where first the students would, for the first half of the time, negotiate online and then negotiate in person physically, and they could compare sort of what approaches worked better in the online environment versus the physical environment, since both are probably things people are going to need to use in their working life when we return back to normal. Perhaps some more approaches like this can be helpful that are sort of leveraging the virtual element that naturally occurs in business settings as well, if we pull these into programs. Perhaps we can open up to a few other questions. I see that Alan Bird has a question. Alan, I've actually unmuted you so that you can talk if you will turn on your microphone. Would you like to ask your question yourself?
Sure, I'll go ahead and do that. I put this question to my exec MBA students, and they surprised me. They asked about questions like, what should corporations do about working with NGOs like WHO that have demonstrated that they're either incompetent or have been co-opted by other players? How do corporations deal with countries that may have weaponized viruses or engaged in other activities to destabilize the global economy? In short, I was getting a lot of questions that suggested that executives see a significantly more dangerous world. And this seems like a topic that we haven't really addressed much in IB education.
So who would like to answer that?
Well, I'll give you an opinion. I think NGOs are a very legitimate thing that we should be teaching about, doing research on, and we don't spend enough time with them. And I know my colleague and Andreas' colleague Martha Mesnevsky is working with the was it the World Wildlife Association. And I think there are things to learn there. And in some cases, I know they may be more advanced in some of the management techniques they're using than a number of companies.
Sri, perhaps you have something to add?
Sure. My sense is that I think we have to be careful about not tarring entire countries or all NGOs with one brush. And this is where I think those deep relationships, the building of trust, really trying to understand the partners that you work with, spending time and investing and committing to those relationships does matter. So even in, I've lived in Nigeria during times which were, pretty dark. We had military coups going on at that point in time and so on. And yet there were, significant, there were partners, there were NGOs who were really trying to do their best for people on the ground. So it's kind of, you really have to, I think, make that effort to understand who you're working with. So Alan, I would be a little hesitant to, just paint every sort of in broad brush strokes, the folks that you're doing business with, that you're partnering with.
If I could respond to that, Carl, I was struck by the questions that my executives were raising, and my focal point is that my executives seem to see a much more dangerous world than I had been seeing. And when I look in the IB education literature, there are areas where we talk about political risk and do other things, and it seems like there may be a need for much more of that type of focus in what we do. The typical IB textbook at the undergraduate level really doesn't deal with those sorts of issues. And as I say, these were coming from my executives, and so for me it was a surprise, and I was trying to make sense of that more than answer their questions about what do we do with this.
Yeah, Alan, I think that's an interesting observation, and I think many of us have focused so much on sort of companies and not thought so much about NGOs, governments, risk, et cetera. And I at least am trying to now bring that more into my teaching. So for example, in the fall in my international strategy course, I've been trying to find some government representative who can come in and talk more about these sort of issues, and been lucky enough to get Esko Aho, who's the former Prime Minister of Finland, to come into 2 sessions of the class to try to address that. And I think it's really an area that we have neglected, both the government and NGO side of things. We have another question from Monia, which is asking about the optimal class size for online teaching, and if you can, easily grow class sizes to be really large and save a whole lot of money, something I guess many people are eager to do. Sri, I see you smiling a little bit. What do you think about this?
We've kept our class sizes similar across online and in-person platforms, because I think if you're trying to deliver a high-value education, I think that that personal connection between a faculty member and a student is still important, and class sizes do matter in that particular case. I mean, I think if you're trying to run some kind of a general MOOC where thousands of people come, and there's peer evaluation, etc. More power to you, but that's not our way of doing business. Let's just leave it at that.
Carl?
Yes, Harry?
The question reflects the, if you will, on the ground thinking. That's not a criticism. The size of the program or classes can be almost unlimited. And I'll give you an example, which is our program. My online course just ended. I had 56 students in it. Now, you have to realize that we use a master teacher model. So I am the master teacher. I am academically qualified. I designed the course. I don't actually teach it. I have 2 instructors. One had 2 sections and one had another section. We do not allow more than 20 students in a section. And the other thing that's important is that it is probably 90 to 95% asynchronous. So you don't want to be thinking about online education being synchronous with the number of people in a class. Then you are limited. So something like the master teacher model can be a very effective way of scaling up your program. And at one point, a number of years ago, when I was acting dean, we get over 1,200 students in our online MBA program. So you need to think out of the box and start doing things differently when you go online. You just cannot take what you do on the ground and put it online.
And Harry, do you think that you will see, the most high-end programs also scaling to be 1,200 students and not sections of 50? And
I'm sorry, the what programs?
Let's say the most prestigious, highly ranked programs you think may have 1,200 people in quite some classes, and people will still be willing to.
No, I don't. I think the most highly ranked programs, the Harvards of the world, there's always going to be a place for the 2-year residential MBA. But I think one of the things that we're thinking about at Northeastern is how is education going to change going forward? And I think the model of lifelong learning is going to become more important. We've already seen in residential executive education courses, companies don't want their executives going away for 3 weeks at a time. You need to do much more online types of courses. And if we start thinking about, one of the things that's happened that we've done is we've had more MS programs, Masters of Science programs, Master of Science in Marketing, Master of Science in Data Analytics or Finance, where newly graduated students from undergraduate programs, they need more specific functional knowledge. They take that program, it's cheaper. You have to remember 2 things were impacting the MBA programs: cost and accessibility or convenience. And that's one reason we went to the master's type, the MS programs, because they're shorter and less expensive than an MBA. Then you get credit for that. If you come back to Northeastern, for example, within 5 years, we accept all those credits, and then you go on to do the rest of the courses for your MBA. So I think things like that are also going to drive the lifelong learning model, where people are going to keep coming back because they need specific knowledge now, data analytics being the most current one. So,
well, Harry, the Finnish government is surely on board with you. They've actually just changed our funding model radically to make lifelong learning and how much we do of that an important component of the amount of funding we receive, actually.
Yeah. And if you do that, you have to be online.
Okay, thanks for the advice. We'll have to keep that in mind. Indeed, I think there probably will be much more online component as one thinks about lifelong learning. We have a question from Benjamin Blake, who is a PhD student, I gather, and asking what advice one has for doctoral students who have not started teaching yet. And I guess I would extend that a little bit to say, for anyone who doesn't have a whole lot of online experience, how do you get going in this game? Sri, I'm sure that's a question you've been thinking a lot about. Can you give us some guidance?
I think learning from others is going to be critical. We have, of course, instructional designers can help, but we also have, we do expect all of our doctoral students to have some teaching experience. And those who have been with us in this online space, in the COVID space, obviously had to make that transition already. But I think just, collaborating with others, we have so many internal kind of seminars where faculty are sharing best practices, where we're, trying to educate our students and our faculty on how to do this better. So I think there's a lot of resources out there. Making sure that they're pulled together and available to everyone is really important.
Hey, thanks. We have a question from Jacqueline as well, who's asking about any thoughts about how to assess online courses. And I suspect she may be thinking, among other things, about how to assess participation, which is a little bit different, but anything. Who would like to answer this? Andreas, perhaps you have some suggestion?
Yeah, Actually, there's an opportunity here for when you do a case teaching workshop or any workshop, any class online live, right? There's actually a better way to do the grading because you have all your participants on one side, you have the names there, and if you have a class of 40, 50, mind you, if you go beyond 40 people, you will have a hard time having them all on your screen. So, but what you do is basically you have people who can participate, who potentially you would overlook or would fall behind on jockeying in the classroom. I mean, the short person in the back with the short arms and the lower voice has the same volume and the same presence to ask a question online and to raise a hand than the tall person in the front who tries all tricks to get the attention, right? So I think there's an opportunity here to improve this part, not just, and going back to the learning object, not just the grading, but also the actual learning, right? Because more people can potentially participate in that way. And you have to come up with grading solutions that avoid jockeying and gamesmanship. But like with copycats, I think sometimes those students who want to cheat, they are always a step ahead of those who are trying to avoid having it avoided.
Thanks, some good tips there. Arthur Lee also has a question for us. He says, great conversation. Sorry, it was just moving on my screen here. Great conversation. I was wondering that will the increasing political tensions at the macro level influence the trust building maintenance processes at the micro level among managers across borders? Any suggestions, Harry?
I think you shouldn't just think that because our political leaders aren't getting along or in conflict that the citizenry are doing the same. I think we're seeing in the United States now how the citizens are all coming together. They're pretty united on a number of issues, the COVID and race relations. But so I think that individual people, companies working across borders, they will continue to function well. I don't think that animosity will trickle down.
Okay.
Can I make a comment?
Given our timing of having about 1 minute left, I think we need to move to having each person make one comment about what you think is sort of a key takeaway that people should have from today, one or two things. So perhaps, Harry, we can start with you and you can bring that into that comment.
Well, what I was going to say is that question about assessment. I have, 5 or 6 cases in my online course, and we do it asynchronously with discussion boards. So the students discuss the case amongst themselves. You can chime in if you want as a professor, but given that I'm dealing with people who are experienced, more like executive MBAs, they learn an awful lot from each other. And then you grade them because you can read what they say. And what I find is when you do it asynchronously, people I find are a lot more thoughtful because they have to write it and it's there for everyone to look at and to read.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so think about the benefits of asynchronous learning. Harry's takeaway. Andreas.
You're frozen, Carl.
Andreas?
Yes, you were just frozen, Carl. Sorry. I do believe that we have to be, as faculty, remain more agile in the future. It's an exciting time. But what you also should not forget is that we are knowledge creators. If you fall into the trap that we are just focusing on making the class experience as great as possible and not bring in this newest knowledge, don't forget the whole situation also accelerates some models that we have been teaching and assumptions that we have been teaching. And you get nowadays spammed by the McKinseys and BCGs of this world every day with their newest blurbs, and often that is not as solid as what we have, and I would say. And in the future, asking yourself really carefully, what is it that we have as unique knowledge that's important for this particular course that we can bring in, and then blend this with the best delivery model, I think becomes more critical. as such. Otherwise, again, you fall back to being an edutainer, and I don't want to be this.
Okay, thanks very much. So we all, I'm sure, want to make sure that it's a really meaningful learning experience and shouldn't just become entertainers. Thanks for reminding us of that. Sri, how about your takeaways for today?
Just, I think connections are going to remain extremely important. And I think apart from the research piece, which Andreas put it so well, I think we also as faculty need to connect with the corporate community, need to connect our students with the corporate community, because there is so much happening there, which is so far ahead sometimes of what we teach. And we have to be aware of where companies are and what they're doing, and and how can we help them do it better. And I think that's the focus. I wish our faculty were more proactive in making, in just being out there and listening to what's happening with companies, with the communities, with the and facilitating those connections with the students.
Okay, surely connections are key, and you are a great person at facilitating that. So maybe you'll run a masterclass for us on building connections. From my side, I think we are going to see some changes, like more focus on risk, perhaps more focus on the role of government, international business, and NGOs, and maybe a little more move towards regionalism. However, at the same time, I think we've seen today that the basics of international business teaching are going to remain the same. There's no substitute for getting the international experience. There's no substitute for having interaction, which can be orchestrated in many different ways. And of course, we want to make sure, as Andreas points out, that we continue to be focusing on learning and not just sort of having entertainment in a way. I think maybe one thing we haven't talked about as much is that most of us, I think, do a great job of teaching and somewhat less good job of teaching content in ways that it can be readily applied. And I think that moving forward is something we all probably are going to have to work on. And there are some interesting opportunities for that, perhaps, as we merge online teaching more. I would like to really thank our panelists for sharing their great knowledge with us today. Sri Zaheer, thank you so much for taking your time out of your busy job as dean to be with us. Harry Lane, thanks very much to you as well, and Andreas Schotter as well. All very interesting insights that we've gained from you and from the panelists. Thank you all for your questions. It's really been an hour that's flown through very quickly. Perhaps we'll have to continue this at another time. Hopefully we've all gotten some food for thought for the time ahead. Thanks very much for today.
Thank you. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you, Carl.